You would love to learn a language, but you are one busy mofo. And how the hell do you do it if you don't have hours to study every night? Get yourself ready for 8 tips on how to study a language with a full-time job. Oh, and by the way, this is exactly what I've been doing with my Spanish. And in less than a year, I've got to the stage where I can start to listen to native material like the radio and podcasts without having to have done any studying at all. Just focusing on listening every day. Now let me explain how this works so you know that you're not wasting your time. Once upon a time, there was a man called Marvin J. Brown. He spent his life trying to work out how people learn languages and noticed that some people learn much better than others. He made his students do drills and exercises, and he made them do this for years. And it turns out it didn't work very well, which reminds me of my language classes in school. After that crushing blow to his life's work, he got a copy in 1983 of Stephen Krashen and Tracy Terrell's book, The Natural Approach. In that book, they advanced Dr. Krashen's input hypothesis that says that adult learners can learn a second language kind of in the same way that children can learn their first language. And the idea is that we focus on communication and understanding the message rather than simply focusing on grammar rules and lists of vocabulary. And this was revolutionary for Marvin Brown, who at that point then decided to change his program, and here he created automatic language growth, which originally he called the listening approach. And so the idea is that students learn best when they just focus on trying to understand the message. So no learning grammar rules and no tests. He also devised a method called crosstalk, which you might have seen my video on already. Basically, he advocated not trying to speak too early. In the early stages, you don't yet know the correct pronunciation, grammar, or anything else, and therefore anything you try and produce might reinforce some bad habits for later on. And so with the right approach, we can effortlessly learn a second language. The key here is that we need a huge amount of comprehensible input, and the biggest factor therefore is time. The good news though is that you can, through this approach, start to acquire a second language without having to sit down and study every night. You can just focus on getting the input and your brain will naturally start to work it out. But stick with me because I'll explain how it works. It's not quite as simple as you just get massive immersion and that's it. There is some nuance here. There are lots of ways to approach language learning, but if you don't fancy sitting down and studying, then this approach might be for you. So listening is where the party starts, but you won't get to the party if you don't understand some of the basics. Obviously, a complete beginner won't have any context for any of the words that they hear, and therefore you need to do something first of all in order to get out of that beginner stage so you can then start to enjoy that listening material. For me, the biggest thing is to understand audio material. Once you can do that, even if it is basic, designed for high beginners, you can listen everywhere you go. So how do you get out of that beginner phase? You can do this in 2 ways. The first way, which personally I would prefer, would be go on YouTube, search for your target language, followed by comprehensible input, ALG or TPRS, and then watch a lot of those videos. Make sure they're ones that you can understand, providing you're following along with any pictures or imagery that's going on. And once you can do that and you pick up the target language naturally, you can then start to move on to other content. Get ones that are designed for a complete beginner. Your brain will start to notice words that are repeated and pick things up if they are in context. The most important thing is that you can vaguely follow along with what's going along. If not, revert back to something easier. You're not going to pick up any new words if you don't understand the context. That's not ideal for everybody because of course it involves initially sitting down and watching videos in a language that you don't yet understand. For those of you who want to learn on the go, this second method is audio only. Now, it's not my preferred method because the teacher will have to use some English, but if you haven't got the time to sit down and watch things, then this might be the perfect method for you. We will have different lifestyles, and if that gets you on your way, then you go for it. So find an audio only resource like Pimsleur, for example, but of course there are many others available, and that will get you out of that initial beginner phase. Pimsleur, for example, teaches you with a sort of call and response type thing, and it says something in the target language and then expects you to respond. Personally, I wouldn't do that. I would just focus on listening, but it's your language learning, you do what you enjoy. Once you get enough input though, you can then start to switch to better audio material, and that's when you can really start to make some progress. Good idea. Search for podcasts that are for language learners, but they are only in your target language. There are plenty about for most languages. That way you can then start to pick up new words just from the context alone, but as I say, huge amounts of input. This is important, and we're trying to learn with massive amounts of listening. And so for that reason, if you're not understanding well enough whatever you're listening to, you're getting the gist, but you don't really understand the nuts and the bolts of what you're listening to, then it might be time to start to search for some easier content, because we want to understand everything around the new words that we're going to pick up. If you can't quite do that with audio material only, even if it is very simple, then I would stick to something that has some visual material first of all. If you're finding them too hard, then just try and find some easier episodes, or perhaps a different podcast that you do find easy enough to understand. You should be able to follow along fairly well in order to pick up those new words and phrases. So trust me on this one, because it's what I've been doing with my Spanish. It does involve a lot of input, but if you get enough, you can pick up the language without having to sit down and force yourself to learn it. Now, accomplished language learners don't think anything of this. They take it for granted that, of course, if you're learning a foreign language, you have to do something every day. But perhaps that's where some of us come unstuck, is that we want to learn a foreign language, but if we're not actually taking steps towards achieving our goals every day, then we're never going to get there. Let's say I bought myself a nice new book in January and I go, this year I'm going to really smash my Chinese. And with the best will in the world, I might put it back down and I'll get to it later on in the week. And weeks go by and then months, and suddenly it's the end of the year and you've got to dust off that book and try and get back into your language learning. Doesn't have to be huge, but whatever you do, do something every day. A different kind of break it down. Me sitting here wanting to get fluent in Spanish doesn't get me to my final destination. And so just desiring that final result isn't enough for me to get to fluency. So what do? So what is more helpful is focusing on those sure steps that are going to help you reach that goal. What are you doing every day that's going to help you reach fluency? Now, don't overdo it. You don't want a long list of, I wish I could do all these things in a day. You're not going to get round to everything, and then you'll lose motivation. What are the one or maybe two things that you can do every day that is achievable, that you can commit to over the long term, and then just do that? You can keep it under review and change it whenever you want, but what can you focus on and commit to in order to reach your end goal? Keep it under review and keep moving forward. So with this method, the focus is on listening input. So that way you'll naturally get used to the sounds of the language rather than when you read it. First of all, if you don't quite know those sounds, you're not going to understand how to pronounce them when you read. And so in that case, you might want to consider holding off on reading first of all. But when you do start reading, it'll be an absolute revelation, because of course the words and phrases that you've seen over and over again, you're going to be able to pick them up quickly in their written form. You're going to see how the letters of that language form those sounds, but you're going to have an intrinsic, more of an innate sense of how to pronounce the words that you're reading, instead of if you pick up a book, first of all, you're going to struggle with those sounds initially. And of course, the benefit of reading is that we can take our time. You can reread passages in order to pick things up. So you can do this any way you want, but when you start, you might have to make yourself do it. And so it might be worth doing something like tracking your hours, so you've got something tangible that you can see in terms of your progress before it becomes a habit that you just do automatically every day. Now, this is a good one. Book packages of lessons online if you can with a tutor, or make an agreement with someone in a language exchange. That way, once or twice a week, maybe even more, you're making a commitment to see another human and you're doing something to do with your language learning. Now, this one is fun because when we focus on input goals, it takes the burden off us to try and speak and potentially get things wrong. There's no worry about our pronunciation, our grammar, or anything else like that. I just have to focus on understanding the message and enjoying the content that I'm using. And this is how you naturally acquire a language. Now, I'm not saying don't speak, but don't put pressure on yourself to speak in the early stages. We need input. Speaking is output. We want to focus on acquiring the language. So anything to do with input is what we want to prioritize. So at the time of recording, I'm still not speaking Spanish, but I can watch YouTube videos intended for native Spanish speakers and understand them. Obviously, Not all YouTube videos, but it's still a start. I've just started watching La Casa de Papel, which is fantastic. So when I do start speaking, I've already got a fairly high level of comprehension, so I already understand a native speaker pretty well. Less of that awkward, they say something to you and you didn't realise it was a question, and you just end up staring at them blankly, just nodding. What do you think? If you do enjoy speaking though, go for it. It's your language learning at the end of the day. So of all of the points, I guess this is the most important. You can read and you can speak whenever you want, down to your personal preferences, but ultimately we just have to get enough input and keep going. If I share my experience of Chinese versus Spanish, in Chinese I struggled for ages and ages trying to do this, a traditional approach with learning lists of vocabulary and grammar. Didn't work for me, but when I moved to finding about comprehensible input, I discovered graded readers, but the main thing was I managed to get the audio for graded readers and I listened to that wherever I went, and that's when I made some serious progress with my Chinese. Whereas for Spanish, the story is quite different. I didn't spend years and years struggling and getting nowhere. Because I knew about comprehensible input, I started with Ollie Richards' Spanish Uncovered course, and then after that I've just focused on listening to Spanish content for 2 hours a day. I'm at over 600 hours of input now, and I'm starting to just be able to watch content for native speakers, say YouTube videos or whatever. I haven't had to study at all. And on top of all of this, I've been using crosstalk lessons with a tutor on italki, and that's been giving me further input of Spanish. And so the ideas in this video are broadly inspired by automatic language growth, and part of that method is to use crosstalk. So this video here will explain how to use that, which is a simple way to boost your language learning and help you get to where you want to be. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.